Where have the running back ceilings gone? That's what we're going to talk about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch from my Stealing Siegel's newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work at RotoViz. And Shawn, we talked just yesterday in real time. I don't know, necessarily when the release schedule will be because we're kind of just recording an extra episode because we wanted to. We talked yesterday about more macro trends. We decided to fire up another one today because you had some great thoughts about the running backs and how they fit in. We spent a lot of time talking about the passing game yesterday, and we just spent a bunch of time before this show discussing the running back stuff, and it's such an intriguing question as well. It starts with the macro trends. It starts with, scoring being down, the defense is playing differently, and the offenses had shifted even prior to that, more receivers on the field. But over these last couple years, just to put numbers on it, we have not had, our buddy Pat Kerrane has been calling it the legendary upside, right? We like to use that term a lot on the show. We have not had the legendary upside season. I mean, Austin Eckler last year, 22 PPR points per game, led all running backs the year prior. Jonathan Taylor led all running backs right about 22 PPR points per game. Go back prior to that, and you have, Alvin Kamara's big season in 2020. He had 25 points per game. That's the kind of legendary stuff we're talking about. Dalvin Cook was 24 that year. Go back to 2019. Christian McCaffrey wasn't just 25. He was 29, right, in 16 games that year. Plays the whole season, elite. In 2020, he only played 3 games, but he was at 30 that year as well. But we had this ability to hit 25 and then even approach 30 points per game in PPR. Todd Gurley in 2018, 26 points per game. Saquon was at 24 that year. McCaffrey, 23.8. Kamara, 23.2. You had more 23-plus guys, back in 2018 than almost any year. Gurley the year prior, 25.8. You go back to 2016, you have the Le'Veon Bell and, David Johnson year where they were both over 25. So from 2016 all the way up until 2021 or 2020, we had a 5-year stretch where you had running backs every season hitting 23-plus PPR points per 25-plus, I think, as I went through that whole list. And then starting 2021, 2022, no back has done better than basically 22 points per game.
And then I want to highlight kind of how surprising this is in some ways before you get into the nitty-gritty of it, because everything we've been talking about in terms of the macro trends are defenses being conservative, defenses trying to take away the splash plays, and rushing efficiency improving. And if nothing else, because some of that's going to be the QBs, but teams being incentivized to run the ball and being given defensive looks where it's going to be, number one, you're going to audible into or simply call run plays because of the look. And then number two, those plays are going to be at least a little bit more effective than perhaps they've been in the past in terms of the success rate, if nothing else. And that's one of the reasons why I think that success rate as opposed to explosive play rate can be a little bit misleading. But when the defense gives you that light front and then you run into it, there are going to be advantages there. You have that, and then you have this trend within analytics where people are saying, look, short yardage, you're trying to convert those third downs. Down by the goal line, you're trying to convert those touchdowns. Running the ball is the way to do it. I mean, instinctively, you're thinking running back workloads are going to benefit in a way that we would see the advantages in fantasy. Running backs would go earlier in drafts. Wide receivers are going to be dealing with the pressure of having more teammates on the field. Maybe those target profiles get diluted slightly and receivers continue to fall. And yet, because of counterbalancing trends, that is not what's happening at all.
Yeah, and there's, several reasons that this could be true. You and I, as I mentioned, have talked now for an hour about this, trying to kind of piece through it. It's very interesting. It's very interesting as, we think about the macro trends that we've talked about and how that fits into the context. We've talked on the last few shows about how defenses are playing more of these cover 2 shells and quarters defenses, and they're putting this umbrella over the top of the defenses. Jordan Rodriguez said in her, awesome, the analogy she used in her awesome play callers series over at The Athletic that we recommend everyone go give a listen to because it's great content. But also they talked on that show about the wide 9 defense, I think it's called, the more athletic edges playing, when the Patriots kind of had the blueprint to beat the Rams playing a 6-man front that really the Patriots stole from, Vic Fangio, having done that with the Bears. And it was a 6-man front, very wide, 1 linebacker, and then also that 4-man, shell over the top sort of, but getting wide so that you can stop the outside zone run. So when they were talking about stopping explosives in the pass game, they were also talking about understanding that in the run game, explosives happen on the edge and in the outside zone and in these, big plays where you get these runners outside the defense. So widening in the lower levels of the defense is the other part of the trends, is sort of what I'm saying. Rushing efficiency has been up. Some of that's because of, quarterbacks running more as well. But rushing efficiency last year at an all-time high in the NFL at 4.5 yards per carry league-wide, which is, you don't see huge league-wide shifts. There had only been a couple seasons in NFL history of 4.4 yards per carry, and then suddenly it's at 4.5. And yet the explosives are not happening. It's just more efficient. It's more 8-yard gains instead of more 80-yard gains, right? We had Jonathan Taylor a couple years ago in 2021. A big part of his 22 points per game was a lot of these long touchdown runs, but we didn't see as many of those last year. But that's not the only element of all this. You pulled up some really great data with the RotoViz expected points and fantasy points over expected tools, where you were looking at the receiving expected points. Kind of blew my mind with this stat.
It's kind of crazy because one of the things that would make intuitive sense to me is that if defenses are taking away the big play, then offenses would have more incentive to get their backs involved in the passing game. You get your guy who is built for running with the ball in his hands, and defenses are back, and you're going to let that guy go to work. And yet that is not what we have seen. You look at the last 6 years, looking back to 2017, and from 2017 to 2020, the lowest number of teams to have 200 or more receiving expected points for the season. So that's all the running backs together, the expected fantasy points you would get from where those targets occurred. In each of those years, you had at least 4. It was 5, 5, 6, and then 4 in the pandemic season. So you have this group of teams that you can count on for pretty big seasons from a running back workload perspective, specifically in the receiving game. 2021 and 2022 combined, we only had 2 such teams. Only 2. The flip side of that is that we get more and more risk to the downside, where from 2017 to 2021, there was only 1 season where more than 2 teams went under 100 receiving E point. So at that point, you go under 100, and it's starting to get really dry from the perspective of your team providing the opportunity for the running backs to score points in the receiving game. Last year, we had 5 teams go under 100. And so suddenly now there are a lot of units out there that are landmines sprinkled across these fantasy draft boards where you select a guy from that offense and you may be looking mostly at the rush EP numbers. And one of the things, Ben, that we've always talked about is that to get to this, again, legendary upside type of back, you really need to have this balance between, the perfect profile is to have double-digit EP on both sides of the ledger, to go over 10 rushing expected points per game and over 10 receiving expected points per game. One of the issues for Derrick Henry has always been that even despite his historic level of rushing production, he's a good, not great fantasy back because of the lack of receiving. One of the things that we've talked about with Nick Chubb, and one of the reasons why we've been a little bit skeptical about his price in 2023 is simply that he doesn't actually have great even rushing EP numbers, and then you have poor receiving EP numbers. So the fantasy point over expectation element that I think people are excited about, and justifiably so, because we want that. We want these guys who can create the plays, want the guys who can create that extra efficiency. But to a very large extent for Nick Chubb, that's already always been baked in because his overall EP numbers are so poor compared to the backs that he is scoring with. So we look at these trends and we're trying to understand, like, how does it seem to intuitively make sense that running backs would have the ball thrown to them more, and yet it's happening less? And we came up with a couple of possibilities as we were chatting before the show.
Yeah, and just to drive that home, I mean, Shawn, we've always talked about the ceilings at running back being this combination of receiving and touchdown, potential, which obviously I have the high value touch stat that I really like, which is just a combination of receptions and green zone touches inside the 10-yard line. Those are the high value ones, right? Those, going back to the initial research, they're fewer than half of all running back touches, and yet they wind up accounting for like 75% of all running back PPR points, because they're the ones that, obviously the receptions are counting for points, but they're the ones that generate more yards in the passing game, and then more touchdowns when you're getting the carries in close. And then we call basically everything else low value: rush attempts, low value touches. You have to be Derrick Henry or Nick Chubb to score a lot of points on those carries, right? You got to run for a lot of yards per carry and hit long touchdowns and those types of things. And I've been doing Stealing Signal since 2017. And the first few years of it, the top backs, these Uber backs, the Le'Veon Bells and the Christian McCaffreys, and I mean, I haven't been writing about the high value touch stats since then, but certainly having looked back at some of the best seasons, the especially like McCaffrey's elite seasons, those guys could average like 10 high value touches per game, which was this amazing, profile and super exciting. The last couple of years, you talked about the receiving EP being way down. We've also seen like the pass catching third down backs kind of disappear. There's no more Theo Riddicks, it seems like, around the league. Nyheim Hines was interesting a few years ago and basically wasn't used a lot last year, traded to the Bills.
Multiple teams took chances on him and said, look, it doesn't actually fit what we want to do schematically.
It doesn't work what we're doing offensively. Exactly. And so you'd think with those guys being gone, what we're learning is, oh, well, then the main backs are just consolidating everything. But that's not what's been happening. Last year, Austin Eckler ran away with the high value touches, like title, as you will, 7.7 per game. He wasn't up around 10. And that's a guy who led the position in receptions last year by a lot. He had 107. McCaffrey was second with 85. There was only one more guy over 70. That was Leonard Fournette at 73. Led receptions by a ton and was also second to only Jamal Williams in green zone touches. So both elements of it, he was top 2 in the league. So he ran away with the high value touch leaderboard, and yet also was only at 7.7, which wasn't the type of high value touch ceiling that we saw a few years back. So even with a guy like Eckler being more able to consolidate all the high value touches in his offense, or maybe not more able to, because obviously there were guys like Le'Veon Bell that were doing this a few years back, but guys like that were able to, because there's not this usage of passing down backs that are splitting up the high value touches in some of these offenses. It's still a lack of ceiling at the running back position for the ones that are even consolidating them in some of these offenses. There was I've written about this the last couple of years in Steelers. I'm having a hard time sort of talking through it because I don't have the numbers right in front of me. But I know in season I was looking at also the number of backs that were hitting like 5 high value touches per game, and that was down as well. And it goes all the way down the list. It's not just the really high end. And so we like you said, we were spitballing some ideas, and it's interesting to think through with the macro stuff. It's interesting to think through from a number of perspectives. With a Theo Riddick or Nyheim Hines type receiving back, I mean, one of the things I said to you is maybe teams are, just saying we don't need those types. They're using receivers in the backfield some. It's like, oh, well, we can just throw to Tyreek Hill in the short area of the field. Maybe they are just prioritizing wide receivers that are, more talented probably in some of these cases than some of the running backs. Another thing, I mean, like that's one option, right? Another option is, I mentioned to you just we have generational stuff going on. So one thing at quarterback, like the team that you could always count on for a ton of running back receptions, more than any other team, and I loved drafting their receivers or running backs in PPR, was Drew Brees' Saints. I mean, they just used the run game or the short passing game as an extension of the run game for years. But also Tom Brady and Phillip Rivers are two other long-standing quarterbacks that threw to running backs a lot, and those offenses featured that a lot as well. And all three of those guys have retired in the last 5 years. So maybe some of this is just and aging out of some of the guys that used to be the high end of the quarterbacks that would be able to process and get the ball to the running backs. And we don't have enough, young quarterbacks that are coming up that are doing that. But also the young quarterbacks that are coming up, they're more mobile. This is the thing you point out to me right away was, well, we have scrambling quarterbacks. We've always said the statue quarterbacks are more likely to check down. The scrambling ones, the more, agile quarterbacks are going to go through their first progressions and then run as opposed to throw to the running back. And so that mobility limits the running back targets as well. And so, to some extent at the quarterback position, we've taken out the top quarterbacks for running back targets and replaced them with some of the profile as the worst, because we've added more and more QB mobility. That's been the big trend at the position. And so it's replacing some of the absolute best quarterbacks for this with some of the worst probably.
And then you can have even an additional sort of contributing effect when you take out a coach that perhaps is very good for it. And Andy Reid hasn't been taken out, but he's got a very unique quarterback now. And he also is an innovator. He spent the early part of his career getting hammered for throwing the ball to the running backs and not getting enough true runs. Now that's looked at just being a generation ahead, because Andy Reid was not running low value plays when the rest of the NFL was. And when he was involving his running back, he was involving his running back in a more efficient play style that got them out on the edge and took advantage of the unique gifts of a Brian Westbrook, of a LaShawn McCoy. You look at where Kansas City has been during this time period that defenses have changed, and you look at their ADOT cratering, and yet so much of that is designed gadget plays and designed, almost college-oriented plays to the receivers. The Chiefs actually arguably even wanted to have a little bit more running back involvement, but you miss on that running back pick in Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who was very directly supposed to do some of those things. And then again, your incentives go to these other types of players. And so if you have a coach who was also one of the leaders in passing the ball to the backs, and now instead he's taken the next step and is using a McCole Hardman, is using a Kadarius Toney, is using some of those other guys underneath, those touches are coming directly out of the touches you would get to a running back in the passing game. Now, there are still going to be some individual games in there where Jerick McKinnon did a lot of damage. There's still an opportunity there. And one of the things I think that we'll mention kind of as we go forward is that maybe you're going to see a further evolution. And this is going to be a short-term trend, but we're definitely dealing with multiple elements here where, even though it's intuitive, we've seen these receiving touches dry up. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about is this idea that perhaps if it looks so easy to just run the ball. I mean, one of the things you see with the Chiefs is that they have, as you mentioned all the time, this huge pass rate over expectation. You can pull up our pace stat and you can see where they are in neutral, leading. They obviously don't trail that much, but as they're going across those different areas and how heavily they are passing. But when they do run, they're running against defenses that are basically begging them to do it. You don't necessarily feel like you have to dump the ball off to your running back to get him in space because the space is being given to you. I wonder if that dynamic is taking away a little bit of the motivation in the back of the coach's mind to be throwing to the backs. And then also, if we have these defenses that are taking away the wide runs, you do have some backs in the last 2 or 3 years where I think we had higher expectations for them. You would hear the coaching staffs talk about getting them involved during training camp, in the preseason. You'd go out in those first couple of games and you'd have these really ugly passes to the runners out on the edge. The defense either right there or you don't get that much value out of it because the space does close up. I mean, are we seeing some of these defenses that remove these explosive runs having a similar neutralizing effect on what you would do if you have a very simple approach at getting your running back involved? I mean, one of the things that has increasingly happened, you talked a lot about it on the previous show, where the defenses are now this and that, and we're going to impose not exactly our will, but we're going to impose our tactics on the offense. So you have this change where there's actually a huge difference between having a mindset of imposing your will versus imposing your tactics. And you now need a more nuanced approach to get a guy a ball in space that you see from coaches like Andy Reid and Kyle Shanahan, and you don't see from coaches who are just like, yeah, we'll throw some screen passes and we'll get a guy out in space. And then you run into the first month of the season where those plays are not getting anything for you. And now you're back to more pure runs and vanilla passes to the receivers.
And then the other side of this, I mean, that's a lot of the reasons why the receiving has been down. But Shawn, you commented to me that the green zone touches have been down. And we went and did a little, research using the RotoViz screener, which is a great way to pull some of this data. I pulled up all the running back green zone touches since 2015, just as a number, but also quarterback rushes since then in the green zone, which again, green zone, 10-yard line and in, and then wide receiver and tight end rushes as well. And, spoiler alert, the quarterback rushes are way up. Prior to 2018, the 3 years I have here, 2015, 2016, 2017, you never had a season with a QB rush attempts league-wide. And I only went from weeks 1 to 17, so I wasn't using the 18th week for these last couple of seasons where we've had an 18th week. In 2015, 16, and 17, you had fewer than 150 quarterback rush attempts inside the green zone. In 2018 and 19, you got up around like 175, 185. And then 2020 through 2022, these last 3 years, over 200 every year, over 215 every year. Same deal with wide receiver, tight end rush attempts in close, fewer than 20 those first few years. And you had a couple years in the 20s. These last 3 years, it's been up over 40. So you have, really starting since 2020, offenses emphasizing quarterback running in close, emphasizing wide receivers and tight ends in close with some of the different trick plays and weird formations. And we've seen teams use the tight end in QB sneaks, right? They motion and they line up and they run a QB sneak. The Chiefs love to do it with like Noah Gray, so they're not exposing Patrick Mahomes to the QB sneak, which he obviously had a serious knee injury doing a QB sneak once already in his career. We see the jet motion handoffs. We see the Deebo Samuel runs, which are just another way that teams are being creative, but it takes away from traditional running back touches. The running back rushes and receptions reached an all-time peak in 2020. That's when scoring was way up. Combination of rushes and receptions in the green zone, all green zone touches for these guys. When I was talking about the wide receiver tight end numbers, I was looking at just rush attempts because obviously the receptions are a separate thing for those positions. Running back green zone attempts reached a high in 2020. It was kind of scaling up, and then it dropped by 90 to 2021, and then another 97 in 2022. It dropped almost 200 from 2020, that big scoring environment during the pandemic, down to last season where the running back green zone touches had fallen, were down. And a big part of that is the quarterbacks taking some of that as we talk through some of the offenses. I mean, it's one of the things when we look at league-wide trends, sometimes you got to think about the individual offenses. There's only 32 of them, right? And so Jalen Hurts last year, I've used this stat before. I think it's really one of the wild stats I've found doing all of my projections across the league. He had more rush attempts, not the team. Jalen Hurts had more rush attempts inside the 10 last year than he had pass attempts. I mean, these green zone touches, they used him on so much design stuff in close, and that's why he had, such a big rushing touchdown rate. But when you have him doing that for the Eagles in close, and obviously Miles Sanders got a lot of rushing touchdowns as well, but that's taking away from the green zone touches in one of the best offenses in the league that should have a ton that are going to the running backs. Instead, a quarterback's getting those, right? You have obviously Josh Allen. You have Lamar Jackson is going to get carries in close. We have a lot of mobile quarterbacks that are getting some design runs in close. Justin Fields got some. I'm trying to think of all the guys off the top of my head, but those different offenses, you think about the handful of offenses where, okay, now quarterback the other team I wanted to say that I was trying to think of there was the Giants. They did it with Daniel Jones a decent amount, more than you'd expect for a guy like Daniel Jones. But teams that are mixing in this type of play calling inside the 10 is, again, league wide is elevating the green zone touches at the quarterback position, which is then taking away from running back ceiling from the other side of the high value touch equation. We have receiving down and we have the green zone touches down.
And that means that we're getting this big chunk out of the rushing EP as well. You mentioned those big seasons from Christian McCaffrey. In 2019, he was at 25 expected points per game. I had mentioned you want to get in that legendary category, you want to be at 10 EP on both sides. He was above 11.5 as both a rusher and a receiver that year. He drops to 24 EP per game in 2020, which is that really high scoring season you just referenced. Still obviously fantastic. That's a season where he only played a handful of games there. But we look to this most recent season, and we only had 2 backs, Ben, that managed even 8 in both categories. One of them, again, is Christian McCaffrey. The other one is somewhat humorously Joe Mixon, who underperformed his EP. And a little bit of that EP, I don't think that there tends to be a ton of faulty EP mixed in here, but Joe Mixon was actually so ineffective. The part of his EP is simply the fact that he gets multiple carries down by the goal line that he doesn't punch in. And so it looks like his opportunity is actually a little bit bigger than if you would look at it from a possessional basis. Those are the
and we talked about that. Just to cut it, we talked about that a lot during the season, and I had a piece circulate on my Twitter timeline, was shared by Cal Dvorak from NBC. Appreciate him sharing one of my pieces, and it was a piece I wrote. He referenced on some of your research as well, but a piece I wrote in season last year where we were talking about this in Stealing Signals, and I was referencing some of your takes in my write up. But this idea that Joe Mixon, as I looked back through this piece, there was a game where Joe Mixon had, I think, on 3 separate drives, had multiple touches in the green zone. So he wound up with 6+ green zone touches in that game. So one of those things where if you get stuffed and then you get the ball again and you get stuffed again. And I think he only scored 1 TD in that game or something, right? Like he got all these opportunities. And if you're continuously getting stuffed and you keep getting these opportunities, every one of those touches, you get all these expected points for it. And it's obviously not legitimate, expected points ultimately. It's just your own inefficiency. And I contrasted that with an Austin Eckler play the week prior to that, because this was written in season, where he had scored from distance. And it's like, well, if he would have got tackled at the 1 and then scored on the next carry, then everyone would have been a lot more comfortable with it and not said that he was too efficient. But because he scored from distance, it was, he's too efficient. Mixon's getting tackled short of the end zone and then also getting tackled short of the end zone another time. And so you actually prefer the running back who scores from distance and gets into the end zone to the one who gets tackled, needs another carry, and then also might not tackle again. Anyway, you just described this, but it is one of those little tricks.
I mean, the other element there is that there is more risk for these high workload backs who were inefficient to lose their starting job than people realize. It may happen at time periods where it gets a little bit less attention, like for Joe Mixon, where he more or less loses the job to Samaje Perine in the reality playoffs. That can happen to you during the regular season. I mean, Joe Mixon, a guy who really on the edge of just getting released by the Bengals this offseason and being in the same situation with Dalvin Cook, but worse because he's not as good as Dalvin Cook, and trying to find a job in this landscape where now you get a Kareem Hunt signing that makes no sense. I mean, you end up with these backfields that don't work for fantasy that start with that workhorse back being inefficient. But before we kind of get to that point, so these trends are hurting backs in general, but they're also taking away from the top end. You referenced the scoring levels that these backs have had. We like to talk a lot about how you need to have that EP, and then you need to have the ability to put up a big season. Now, I think that people don't understand that exactly because they're saying, okay, those numbers are not as stable. That's not the point. The point is the player has to have the talent level to, on occasion, to within his range of outcomes and within the 2 or 3 year window that you're looking at. You don't know which year it's going to be, but you need to hit on a guy who could potentially give you 4 or 5 EP per game to get to those numbers you're talking about. The actual workload based numbers are even considerably lower, to where 2022 was the first season since 2009 when Chris Johnson led the way. And we know that Chris Johnson doesn't exactly have the type of profile that people love either, from that perspective of being a little guy who does need the long runs and, will fall down when he gets hit. I don't necessarily mind that because I love the run to daylight. We talked about how that's getting more difficult. Anyway, 2022, the first season since 2009 to not have a back average 20 expected points per game. Not even get to 20. And Austin Eckler leads the way, only 19. I mean, that may seem somewhat close, but I mean, you're talking about on a per game basis and how that works through there. And Eckler was the only back in the NFL who managed to hit that 10 receiving EP level. Unfortunately for him, his rush EP is always going to be lower than that. And even though his rush FPOE was actually quite good last year because of some long touchdowns, there's some risk with a player like Eckler who is actually not a great pure runner. And so if you were to draft him and get a season where he's like 2 points below expectation, probably not on a full game basis, that would be more difficult to do. But he could underperform as a rusher, not have the rushing EP, and then be extremely reliant on that receiving EP workload. So not getting the profiles that we need. And I think that for me, it's really easy to think, okay, well, what we're seeing with running backs is in most cases an awareness that the market forces that people have always referenced as being the reason you have to select running backs. The people have finally realized that's not true because you have this huge emphasis on best ball, and best ball shows it very clearly. And I think of Mike Beer's fantastic tools that we're lucky enough to have on RotoViz as one of the areas that have really opened people's eyes and show that. Obviously, there's lots of other great research out there as well. But once you see that you don't have to load up on those running backs, that changes things for people. And yet, the fact that running backs simply aren't scoring as many points is also huge. And I look to your projections for the 2023 season, and I see 6 individual wide receivers projected with 300 or more points, and only 2 running backs, Christian McCaffrey and Austin Eckler. So the dynamic that we're seeing there is one where people are doing a better job now of chasing the points, better than they were doing in that, say, 2008 to 2013 time period, where, I mean, you could crush leagues by going with a 0 RB type of approach in that dynamic. We talked about 2009, for example, as being one where running back scoring, again, very low. But when you look at that and you're looking at Justin Jefferson's projection, when you're looking at Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, Jamar Chase, Stephon Diggs, Amon-Ra, and you're contrasting that to running backs who can get in that range of being McCaffrey and Eckler, there's no question it changes the dynamic in terms of how fantasy drafters are looking at the first round.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And one of the things I mentioned is there's a couple different sort of maybe generational things here. And talked about the quarterbacks shifting, but the other big one is the running backs. And Sean talked about this a bit before the show, but I mean, the class that I always go back to is that Jonathan Taylor class. You had Clyde Edwards-Helaire in the first round, who's probably always, unfortunately going to be a bust. But between J.K. Dobbins, Cam Akers, and DeAndre Swift, you have 3 guys that have had a really hard time staying healthy. But I said to you, in another universe, Jonathan Taylor and those 3 guys, and Taylor gets hurt last year as well, but those 4 guys could be top 5 running backs at this point. They're in that age range right now. This should be their prime, but that whole class got wiped out by these serious injuries. Akers tears his Achilles, Dobbins tears up his knee, and then has, additional issues a year later. And hopefully we'll see these guys come back a little bit, but they haven't been great. You point out to me, obviously, Etienne gets hurt and misses his first season. In the next class, Javonte Williams gets hurt in that class. Breece Hall last year, the breakout rookie, gets hurt and is dealing with the rehab from an ACL tear. These last few classes, 4 running back classes, where we should have seen some superstars probably, have unfortunately been decimated by injury. Meanwhile, we had a really great run of backs that are now aging out. We talked about it last year. I remember that whole second round of running backs last year was these 25-plus guys, and a lot of them have aged out. We still have, Derrick Henry still going up in that range. But, Joe Mixon has fallen back now. Aaron Jones has fallen back now. Dalvin Cook, obviously, has fallen back now. These guys were all second-round picks last year, but they have kind of aged to the point where, they're not the thing in fantasy football for long. I mean, they might still be in the discussion. Ezekiel Elliott has aged out now, right? And Nick Chubb is getting up there, and Eckler and McCaffrey, who are my top 2 projected running backs, as you said, are getting up there. And you referenced the projections. I mean, obviously projections can lie a little. I'm going to be a little bit biased towards the pass and everything. But one thing I always note with projections, I look at the league-wide trends. I wind up more run-heavy because I'm assuming positive things for every offense. some of the teams that end up the most pass heavy are the ones where everything goes wrong. They start to trail in a lot of games. I'm assuming mostly health in most offenses. So I end up with a little bit of a run lean with my overall league projections, which I think is sort of fair. And I'm also assuming more health at running back than we're probably likely to see. I'd tailor that down a little bit, but it is, there's not a lot of running backs that, even if you're assuming the offense is pretty healthy and that back is pretty healthy, that you can project for huge ceilings going into this year as well. And some of that is that generational thing. We have some new guys coming in, Bijan and Gibbs. We're hoping that those guys are going to be superstars, right? We hope that Dobbins or Akers or Taylor or these guys are going to come back and show real season-long ceilings again, the ones that are 2 or 3 years into their careers here. Maybe some of the old guys, maybe we'll get some, this would be the generation where we could get some ceiling out of 28-year-old backs. We haven't had really great 28-year-old running back seasons in a while, but we haven't had as many good backs as we have right now that are aging to that age. So it wouldn't be that surprising if McCaffrey or Eckler had that ability. We used to see that more. It's a different NFL now, but Marshall Faulk was productive into his 30s. Priest Holmes post 25, his whole career, very short-lived, but it all kind of came later on in what we think of as a running back age curve. Nowadays, it was later for him. And there are guys that are able, I think Sean Alexander, maybe MVP season, I want to say was maybe like age 27. A little bit older, I think. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but definitely some guys back in the day that were able to produce into their later 20s. Hopefully we'll see some of those guys at this point as well. But right now, you look at the running back class. A lot of people want to know why running backs aren't going as high. Like, who are you taking? Bijan Robinson, we're all high on. We're taking him in the first round, but there's a reason he's in the RB3 discussion, because who else is there? Tony Pollard, we're going to project him forward for a lot of work, and we're going to have him in that RB3 discussion, RB4 discussion. Nick Chubb, you talked about it, wasn't a workhorse in college, never been a workhorse in the pros. We're expecting or projecting really with his ADP in age 27, age 28, for him to have the biggest workload he's ever had in his college or pro career, to catch a bunch of passes and run as much as he's ever run before. But that's why he's going, at the 1-2 turn right now. You keep going, Ramondre Stevenson, Breece Hall, all these guys. And then you think about the actual real world stuff that running backs are facing, and how, Jonathan Taylor sort of holding out right now, asking for a trade. J.K. Dobbins kind of holding in. He's at camp, but weird reports there. Josh Jacobs doesn't want to sign the franchise tag and is holding out right now. Saquon Barkley did come back. We just saw Kareem Hunt land with the Saints, but you still have Leonard Fournette and Ezekiel Elliott and Dalvin Cook kicking around as we record this. A lot more names than we've typically had in free agency at the running back position in August. And on more than half the teams in the league, we're thinking about in August, a few weeks away from the start of the season. Is somebody going to land in this backfield and shake things up? Or is this running back going to hold out? Or we don't even know how to allocate the touches. We've often talked about how at this time of year, the fantasy football industry is usually too certain about running back volume, but you can't be certain in 2023. We don't know any situation that seems clear, right? So, there's a few, but there's not a lot that seem particularly clear. It's a weird year. It's a weird time. In addition to what we were just talking about, where in 2021 and 2022, as the seasons played out, running back ceilings were down. The profiles aren't looking great going into 2023. And maybe those things are linked. Maybe part of the reason, that it's hard right now to justify the big running back deals is, it's not helpful that a lot of the young backs have gotten hurt, and we don't have a lot of running backs doing superstar things in these last couple of years and staying healthy. If Breece Hall stays healthy last year, if Javonte Williams stays healthy, maybe that helps Jonathan Taylor get his extra contract, just because it's like, oh yeah, we're looking around the league, we're seeing running backs producing. It's a tough time at the position, both from injury perspectives and from, the generational element of it, and from the way that teams are playing and the ways that defenses are playing. And there is more running, but it's more low value running, right? And it is more efficient, but it's not explosive for long touchdowns necessarily. And so there's a lot of things happening here. But Sean, how do we play it? What does this mean for 2023 fantasy drafts? What does this mean? That we just target guys that are, we think are going to get a whole bunch of touches? Part of me has been like, well, this is part of why Josh Jacobs really worked last year, as well as Josh Jacobs played very well and added efficiency to his profile. we've talked about this. He improved both his workload and his efficiency in the same season. Great year for him. But I mean, are there guys that I've typically wanted to have nothing to do with that just project for a bunch of volume that I should be considering? Because if the RB ceilings are down, like, I mean, should I just be chasing touches again? Are we going back to that type of analysis?
I don't think we should be chasing touches. That's you can probably always count on that response to me. I do want to reiterate your point, though, about the injuries, because I think that it's easy to think that maybe the macro trends are too definitive or more definitive than they are, where partly what we're seeing is just that the guys who would have been Le'Veon Bell, who would have been David Johnson, who would have been Ezekiel Elliott, who would have been Saquon Barkley, and for Saquon Barkley, it's maybe just himself, right? The players who would have been those guys got hurt. And there are only a limited number of players who can really do that, which is one of the reasons why right from the beginning at RotoViz, the Fantasy Douche, Frank, had a lot of great articles about how running backs were probably overvalued in reality. That's become obviously a trope that everyone believes in, more or less. But at the same time, that there are differences in running backs. And for me, that's always been a part of Zero RB, in that I think that a lot of people who read the article or hear about the article secondhand are thinking that I'm saying running backs don't matter and that you should lean into that just 1,000% of the time. My point is more that we only have a small handful of guys who are these legendary types of players. And if you are not in position to take them, you cannot chase, because once you get out of that group, then that production can be replaced by the guy who becomes the starter in week 12 because the guy in front of him got hurt, and in some cases can even score more points because now you're not splitting them. You have a little bit more of a gap. Now, each team is different. There are teams where the 1 and 2 guys are in a committee. There are teams where the 1 guy is the star and the 2 and 3 guys are in a committee. You move that guy up and maybe you're not replacing that full production, but you can look at those things on the team level and figure out where you need to be and where the talent is. But the idea with Zero RB is simply don't chase these superstar profiles, because everybody else can be replaced, but you still can't replace those stars. And so if we have a 3 or 4 year window, like you just described, you don't have the profiles that would have completely changed our vision of how the recent past has occurred. And it's not just that you have some of the best and most exciting names who are hurt, but I do want to, again, emphasize the point that they were hurt when they were young. And even though that can sometimes feel like, oh, it's not a big deal because, what were you going to get from them as a rookie anyway? And yet, one of the other reasons that Zero RB has worked is that those early seasons are when you get the massive production from so many of these guys. It's unfortunately one of the reasons why the contract stuff has been so difficult, is that it's not even necessarily for all the backs, that it's the whole first contract. You're talking about those first 2 or 3 years, you're going to see massive scores. And if you take those massive scores out, then they're simply gone, right? They're not replaced by other players. So when I'm thinking about how I want to play 2023, partly I'm looking at just the normal thing of who do I think is more talented and where am I likely going to get some out production or some overperformance. But I'm also looking at these guys who have been injured and trying to make some calculated bets. The bets don't always work. Made some calculated bets on J.K. Dobbins last year, and even though his actual peripherals were extraordinary, certainly he was a big miss for fantasy. The calculated bets don't always work. But when I'm looking at Jonathan Taylor, where he's priced, and we got some more bad news on him today. And so again, keep the news in mind when you're actually on the clock if you're drafting like this week, for example. But when you're looking at Jonathan Taylor, when you're looking at Breece Hall, when you're looking at Travis Etienne, who now is another year kind of removed from the injury concerns, when you're looking at J.K. Dobbins, when you're looking at Javonte Williams, I think that you have to have some exposure to these guys who would have been the players who would be getting drafted in round 1 if the injury elements hadn't happened. because those are still basically the only guys that you can get difference-making scores from. You've got to balance the injury risk with what we could be seeing when we project forward to 2024 and what we could be saying a year from now, where, I mean, I'm not saying I think it's more likely than not that it'll happen. I think it's more likely than not that 2023 will be somewhat similar to 2022. But following the running back apocalypse in 2015, you had one of the best seasons from a fantasy perspective for running backs there in 2016, because you got this ADP shift and you got some guys who got a little bit healthier and scored some points from that round 3 range, which would make RB a viable move. Anytime that you get like a LaShawn McCoy scoring out of round 3, then suddenly you're talking about stacking legendary upside profiles. 2023 gives us massive risk, but it also gives us the ability to stack those profiles in a way that we haven't ever had before. And then those incentives are counterbalanced by this issue where there's so much wide receiver pressure. I love it for those reasons. But Ben, I mean, those are some of the guys I'm looking at. The other thing that I kind of want to point out, again, it kind of goes back to this idea of when do the big seasons happen and how are NFL teams looking at the running backs. I think the selection of Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs give us a little bit of insight. Now, one of the things you can say is just because 2 out of the 32 teams did something super weird in the draft and took these running backs doesn't mean that that's an indication of a trend. It's always a problem when you're trying to look at what happened in the draft and draw conclusions, because the team that picked an individual guy could be the only team. But one of the things that we heard, and I don't have the sources to confirm or, deny this, but you heard that one of the reasons those guys went so early, and especially Gibbs, who I don't think people were looking at in that category, especially after Breece Hall, who had this type of profile, especially after a Jonathan Taylor, who had this type of profile more similar to Robinson, not necessarily to Gibbs. But he was somebody, when he went that early, everyone was shocked. And then you heard, well, he went that early because a lot of other teams were like hot on Detroit's heels to take him, that a lot of other guys were going to select him if the Lions hadn't.
Yeah, you're saying with Hall and Taylor, those guys just went in the second round in the last couple of years. Like, why would – but it seems to be that there was some real pressure, or at least from the Lions' perspective, they've said it that way, that there was some real pressure that they had to take Gibbs that high, right?
And I think that gives you an indication that there are teams out there. And, partly we're looking at it's like one of those teams is the Falcons. So, how much information does that give you? We know that they want to do weird stuff at running back or in the running game. But there is an indication that teams do think that with the right game plan, and the Lions have been very upfront about their belief that they think they can win in this new environment with Sam Laporta and Gibbs, and that was more important to them than adding a receiver. I mean, I think it's still a little mind-boggling that you could get JSN where the Seahawks got him. I think teams are going to regret that. But the Lions went out with a very clear plan to build their offense around some of those pieces. I don't think the running back position is dead for reality. I don't think the running back position is dead for fantasy. I think we're going to get some big seasons that are a lot of fun over the next 2 or 3 years.
I love your take that we need to look at those profiles that should be the guys in the first few rounds if they hadn't gotten hurt. One of the things about the running back dead zone over the years has been, since the very first year I wrote about it, the very first article I wrote about it, I mentioned the guys that did succeed there, or maybe it was the first series of articles, I don't know, first offseason. The guys that do succeed out of there are overwhelmingly rookies or second-year players. They were guys at that time, I was looking back at, these first-time breakouts that came out of the dead zone. So it was Arian Foster in his second year. It was Ray Rice in his second year after a down first year, where we didn't really know what these players were necessarily, and they had these huge upside seasons. But when it was a veteran who had been around for a few years and the market didn't think they were worth a pick, they were worth a pick in the first, 2.5 rounds or 3 rounds, then you had a pretty good idea that they didn't actually have that type of upside, right? And so that's been sort of the big trend with the dead zone. What we have this year in the dead zone is a lot of players that we don't really know what they actually are. I mean, some of them are not rookies or second-year players, but when we talk about J.K. Dobbins and Cam Akers, they almost might as well be because they got hurt so young. One of the reasons I keep bringing up Akers, and I know he's probably not your favorite necessarily, but this is a guy who at 21 was in the NFL, was very young, and then tears his Achilles in his first offseason after that. And so I wrote about him recently and compared him to the Deontay Foreman timeline, which took several years. And Foreman had some other issues as well. But Foreman gets back to being productive in the NFL at about age 25, age 26. Foreman, another back who entered the league at age 21 and tore his Achilles so young that with the Achilles being an 18-month, 2-year rehab, was able to get back when he was still reasonably young, right? I mean, a lot of the issue with the Achilles and guys not returning from it is if you tear it at 24 and it's a 2-year rehab, now you're 27 years old, by the time you get back on the field after 2 years off. And so anyway, Akers is a guy who, it's a tough road back, but he tore his Achilles early enough, essentially, that, he got back late last year, was pretty good at the very end of last season. I do think he's young enough still that there's some potential that he could be, somebody we still see something pretty exciting from. But again, another guy who we don't know what he is. Akers just turned 24 in June. I wanted to look up his age there to really follow up on that. But yeah, he's now more than 2 full years removed from that Achilles tear in the 2021 offseason, and will be when the season starts. That's about the timeline that we think it might take. But to be 2 years removed and still be 24 is kind of a rare thing, that there's probably not a lot of data on those types of backs. So anyway, that's an interesting thought on him. But yeah, Dobbins, Akers, Kenneth Walker is another guy, second-year player. We don't really know what he is. The market's not really bought in yet, but he could be a superstar for, sort of all we know. Travis Etienne, he's going into his third year, but he missed his entire first year. It's another guy where we don't really know. We have such limited data. It's, sometimes I think some of this stuff is just small sample size stuff. I think the big reason Etienne's being pushed down is no one wants to buy his receiving workload. And I very much don't believe that that's what he's going to be as a receiver, that this guy that just doesn't really get used. I think we're going to look back on year one as sort of the surprising part of his, career from a receiving workload perspective, even though there is a lot of talk about Tank Bigsby and a lot of stuff there. But those are talents that this year, Javonte Williams, another one. This year we are looking at, and Breece Hall has fallen to the 4th round. There's another one that I wasn't even really considering as a dead zone guy. But we're looking at a dead zone now that has a bunch of players that wouldn't be dead zone players probably if they were able to stay healthy. They do fit this mold of when guys have hit real ceilings out of the dead zone, it's players that we didn't really know what they were, or we had, it wasn't a healthy veteran in the dead zone. Like the difference between those guys and Najee Harris, who was also young, is Najee Harris has mostly played a couple of healthy seasons, and the market is just saying, we don't think he's very good. We don't think he's worth these elite picks, right? We think all of these other receivers are better than him. That to me is a pretty good indication of past dead zone-y backs that you wanted to avoid. Miles Sanders is another one I've thrown out. Aaron Jones falling back into that range. For him, probably more about the offense and no longer having Aaron Rodgers, but still the market is saying something there. They're not buying the talent anymore for him. He doesn't get enough of a workload, and the offense might not be good enough, and so now we're concerned about him. When those guys who we know who they are and they used to go high and now they're going lower are falling into those ranges, that's the type of dead zone back I want to avoid. But there's a lot of dead zone backs this year, the younger ones, the injured ones, the profiles you were talking about that could have been top 2-round picks in another timeline where they didn't get injured so early in their career. Yeah, they're risky. The health stuff is concerning, but it's a really interesting year in that way at running back, where those are a lot of profiles. I would be willing to bet that we're going to get dead zone ceiling this year at running back, like from somewhere, because there's enough profiles that fit the rare type of dead zone ceilings we've gotten. You don't usually have this many of those profiles in the dead zone at the same time, this many that drafters don't want to buy into, and they're being pushed down because it's, we don't really know if they're good and if they'll get the workload and this, that, and the other thing. And so, yeah, it's an interesting year. I love that you brought up the zero RB as a way to play this as well, because, we talked last year, I was, using that Frankenstein running back term. And one of the things we talked about with that stuff was it's easier to find a Frankenstein running back to replace the 20 point per game, or not necessarily fully replace it, but like, if your Frankenstein running back build can get you to whatever, 18 points per game, And I know that sounds like a lot. I mean, that's top 5 running back last season to have an 18 PPR points per game running back. But part of the whole thing of this idea of the Frankenstein thing is like, oh yeah, when you have the spot starts like the Alexander Madison, and you're going to plug him into your lineup, and he gets you a 25-point game, like that helps your average, obviously, right? So you're trying to piece these things together. If you're able to hit like 18 points per game, obviously that's not that far off from the guys that are right at 20. The problem is the guys that get up to 25 points per game. But if no one's getting up to 25, if the RB1 is going to be at 22, and you're able to on spot starts and mixing and matching and working the waiver wire and doing a traditional 0 RB build where you have some guys in there that you're able to play for some floor some weeks as well, you're able to average something like 17, 18 points per game. I mean, you're going to be in the mix. You're not going to get buried by these truly legendary seasons if they're not there. And that's part of the reason that 0 RB has been successful in a lot of the formats the last couple of years, is we haven't seen the legendary seasons to bury it, right? That it is more replaceable at 20 or 22 PPR points per game for running backs, which obviously, in half PPR, you just scale it down, or in other scoring systems, you just scale it down. But yeah, I mean, a lot of thoughts there in terms of where we're going, what's going to happen. I do agree with you, Sean. I think we're going to see some more pivots. We're going to see some running back seasons that are truly special in the future. But it is interesting. At the very top, Christian McCaffrey, a guy who used to have that 30 PPR point per game potential. When he got traded midseason last year, Sean, I was real excited. I wrote an article right away that he was the most important player in fantasy again. We talked a lot about that on the show. And, I mean, he obviously had a pretty good run. He's now going in the top 5. But you look at the numbers in San Francisco, and some of the concern that was immediately bandied about is valid. I mean, he lost a decent amount of the rushing work. Those are mostly low-value touches, but also his receptions, while very strong, weren't necessarily through the roof. His high-value touches a lot lower than they were in his peak seasons in Carolina, and that's why, when he was in San Francisco, he averaged about 22 points per game in the San Francisco stretch, not 25-plus points per game. If he's in that, same sort of high-value touch range where, they have other interchangeable pieces in the passing game, they're using Debo and those guys, and they're not using him when they have big leads. They're using Elijah Mitchell, or, if Mitchell's hurt, then Jordan Mason or whoever. Then, he might not have the legendary 25-plus point per game ceiling, even though he's, seems to have been built to score fantasy points. And certainly, can do such creative things in the receiving game that I do still think, obviously, he has this massive potential. But just looking at the way that he was used in San Fran, there's a little bit of a cap on it. They have plans to win a Super Bowl. I don't think they're going to push him to the degrees that Carolina was pushing him. They want him to be vaguely healthy, and they have a lot of weapons. So anyway, I don't know that he has the same ceiling he had in his absolute prime. He's still, I think, a very good candidate to be taken in the first round. But Eckler, same, 28-year-old, another guy who has a great high-value touch profile, but has a little bit of, concerns at this point. And then who else is it at the top that immediately has a type of profile where we say, oh yeah, this guy can score 25 points per game? There's not a lot. I mean, we were talking about sort of RB3, RB4, RB5 range. Like, part of the reason that receivers are going so high is, who do you take? I mean, we've liked all offseason the guys in the third round, the Ramondre Stevenson, the Breece Hall, that group, but there are concerns there too. There's probably going to be, there's been a lot of rumors about veterans landing in these places. Probably going to be one in New England. Sounds like maybe not one in the Jets, with the Jets, but there's been a lot of talk about Dalvin maybe landing there. Who knows? But yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating running back landscape this year, and understanding sort of the trends in the last couple of years, the ceiling being down, how we got here, and then what you need to win and what you're trying to accomplish. I think you hit the nail on the head when you start talking about these profiles that can be efficient. Because if everybody's workload is down, if we're not seeing, the number of teams that are producing the receiving EP at the same level, then everyone's expected points are down. It's not just that you can look for some guy who's getting a ton of work, because nobody is getting 20 expected points per game as you laid out. You still have to be efficient. You got to have one of the better workloads in the league to be the overall RB1, but you got to be efficient on that. That was the point that you drove home on this podcast. You've been driving home for years on the Ceiling Bananas. It requires, when you think about it from expected points and fantasy points over expected, requires 4 or 5 fantasy points over expected per game. You can't be just workload alone and be that legendary upside player.
And let me throw out a few more names for you. after how well you kind of set it up there. When we're thinking about how we get to that efficiency, we're going to be emphasizing things that are straightforward, like speed, the ability to, when you break a tackle, to get value out of it, to when you get through the hole, to be able to get value out of it. You can get that from our Workout Explorer, obviously plenty of other sources you can as well. I like these guys who have the before contact ability and the after contact ability. The before contact ability either suggests that they have the vision / explosiveness to not get constantly hung up at the line of scrimmage, and or their offense puts them in that situation. Either way is good, especially if it's both, which you do get occasionally for some guys. You look for that. And then if they can add the after contact element as well, they're not going down on the very first touch. That's helpful. One of the names that really jumped out to me kind of thinking through that is a Kenneth Walker, right? Who has 4.38 speed. He's someone who a couple of his closest comps in our Workout Explorer are Ray Rice, a guy you mentioned blowing up in year 2, DeAndre Swift, who has that receiving element and that before contact element, hasn't been able to stay healthy, has ruined some of the things that he's done from a fantasy perspective. But when you're thinking about guys who could maybe add a lot on the receiving side, which I guess I'm not necessarily projecting that for Walker, but I do think that that is a part where that part of it isn't priced in at all. And you look at someone with his background and you often get that addition on there. But also with Walker, you have that Charbonnet concern. And I think that you can think about that as this kind of discount play off of a Nick Chubb. Because even once you lose those EP points, you think about Chubb, for example, always losing those to Kareem Hunt. When you have a guy like Walker who has that speed, and then Ben, last year, he was at 21% evasion rate. His broken tackle percentage was above 12%. When you have a guy with 4.38 speed who is breaking tackles at that rate, you have a potential superstar. And or if you miss, you've got a guy potentially like a Nick Chubb who, he's not going to score 25 points per game. The workload isn't there. But if you have 13 EP and add 4 and now you're at 17, that will work for you out of rounds 5 and 6, right? The other name I wanted to mention, and the thing that just I think makes it so hard is keeping his ADP down. But when you think about a guy who maybe is actually a little bit less like completely dynamic than most of the names that we're looking at, but maybe does have that legendary profile if things break the right way, Ramondre Stevenson has elite peripherals for 2 consecutive years. And last year, again, when you pull up that stealing signals tool, you see that he was number 4 in the NFL in high value touches in a terrible offense. And so one of the things you're trying to do when you make picks on the clock are feel out the areas where the price is actually anchored to something that doesn't really represent what 2023 is going to be. Do we think that the New England Patriots are going to go out and be a top 5 team in scoring or yards or what have you? No. Well, we already have gotten very clear indications that Mac Jones is playing much better and that this offense is functional, that their practices make sense, that they are doing normal NFL team things on offense. You put Ramondre Stevenson into that context, and suddenly you're talking about a guy who is borderline legendary if he doesn't have somebody else dropped in on top of him who takes out like a 5 EP chunk. As you mentioned, it seems like the Patriots are wanting to go that route, but it's not guaranteed, and it's not guaranteed that the guy that they put in actually does anything. If you put Dalvin Cook in there, then he probably does. If you put Leonard Fournette or Ezekiel Elliott in there and you give them 10 touches in the first game and they gain 15 yards and torpedo 3 of your drives, they are not going to get more than 2 or 3 touches the rest of the way because you simply cannot give them the ball. So don't worry about it. Right? Don't worry about it. It's going to be Ramondre Stevenson. And if anything, it's Pierre Strong, who behind him is the issue.
And one of the things with a guy like Stevenson, we used to talk about this all the time, Sean, go all the way back to David Johnson. You know, when you're a back with size who can catch and you're in a little bit of a committee, you want the receiving work first and then hopefully you get the rushing work. One of the concerns for Stevenson that's held his ADP down is there was some talk early in camp that Ty Montgomery was going to play on passing downs and take all of the receptions. I got a bunch of tweets. We talked about him last year a lot. Oh, are you in on Ty Montgomery again? And it was like, no. I mean, I was last year because I was worried that he was going to take the receiving work, take the James White role. The role didn't exist last year. Ramondre Stevenson had a season where he had 88 targets and 69 receptions, 4th most receptions at the running back position in the NFL, actually third most targets. Okay, coming off that year, I'm not worried about Ty Montgomery a year older when he couldn't stay healthy last year. I have a completely different read on the situation when Ramondre Stevenson just did that in the passing game last year. The team might think differently, but I would like to believe that, Ramondre Stevenson could win out on that. He's already shown that ability. That in year one, he only had 14 catches, a huge difference for him in the passing game in year two. But as you said, if somebody like Ezekiel Elliott lands there, then okay, he's going to get some of these low value touches. They're going to use Ramondre Stevenson. So for me, actually, Zeke landing there means, okay, well, we probably are going to keep using Stevenson in the passing game more. Let Zeke have some of the low value touches, and then maybe Stevenson works into that work when they realize Zeke sucks, as opposed to spelling Stevenson early in the year with some Ty Montgomery receptions. And I actually like the configuration better where he's being spelled by Zeke on the low value touches than by, somebody like a Ty Montgomery on some of the routes where basically what I'm saying is I think they would keep Stevenson on the field more likely on more passing downs if he wasn't earmarked in week one for a huge rushing role as well. And then, he can work his way into that rushing role. Anyway, I love that. That's a great name. That's a guy that I have taken a lot of in the early third round. But Shawn, another thing you said is with these guys going in the third round, fourth round, you go back to the year where LaShawn McCoy had the great third round production. You said, that's helped, a robust RB start work. And as you were saying that, I was kind of smiling because I have, I've done a lot more best ball drafts this year than I ever had. But even when in the best ball drafts that I've done in the past, I've had a hard time trying like hyper fragile strategies and trying these strategies where you take a lot of running backs early. It's just not really in my ethos. It's been a lot easier this year, not necessarily because I want to, but I have done builds where, when you can get Travis Etienne in the fourth round, if you take Eckler at 7 or you take Bijan at 10, then you take a receiver in the second round, but then you get Breece Hall in the late third, and then you get to a spot in the fourth round where there's not really a receiver that you love, but you're looking at, Travis Etienne at running back, and you're like, yeah, I've already taken 2 running backs. I got a double anchor. I only have 1 receiver. I'd love to take a receiver here in the fourth round, but I'm not going to take, Terry McLaurin over Travis Etienne. All right, I'm going to try a 3 running back in the first 4 round build, and I'm going to see if Eckler, Breece Hall, and Etienne is going to be a trio where all 3 of those guys are the top 3 running backs in the NFL this year, because that's possible. We shouldn't be able to go after those profiles in the late third and the early fourth, but we are right now able to do that. And that's another way this season could certainly play out. But I think the more logical answer, and this is what the ADP trends are doing, and this is, people are asking, why are no running backs going high? But the more logical answer is, okay, just take your receivers in the first and second round, and then take Breece Hall in the third round, or Ramondre Stevenson in the third round, and then look at, ETN in the fourth, or Kenneth Walker at the late fourth, early fifth, or, even mid fifth in some of these, and look at J.K. Dobbins a little bit later. You can still get your double anchor running back essentially, but you can just load up on early receivers or get a tight end in the first couple rounds, or take one of the elite quarterbacks if you really want to go that route. It's a whole different drafting landscape, but when you look at it and you think about building a team out and you work back to front, like we always talk about with draft planning, where you want to take your running backs, you can put yourself in the position like I described, where in round 4 I wanted to take ETN and I already had 2, or you can plan ahead a little bit and just take the receivers early, and then you get into round 4 and you're like, all right, now I'm happy to take ETN. I already got 3 receivers at this point, and so there's a lot of different ways to build, but I think, if you give me one draft and all the money's on the line and all these things, I would probably prefer to be hitting receiver in the first round and probably again in the second. And then, the third round is a really nice spot to get your RB1, and you're kind of building that way. So there's a lot of Gibbs is the other one I didn't mention. It just popped in my head, but I was talking about Breece Hall and ETN in the third, fourth round. But you start getting Jahmyr Gibbs in the fourth round too, and late third. God, I want to take him every chance I get. So, there's so many opportunities to then build where in the third and fourth round in the past, I would not want to be taking a running back. I'm the dead zone guy, as some people, like you like to say. But I'm the first one to tell you that there's reasons not to want those running backs, but I want them this year.
And you have to look at where different positions are being pushed and where the flat areas are. And it has not necessarily been the case in most seasons that round 3, round 4 was a weak area for wide receiver. But I mean, it certainly appears to be that way right now in 2023. I just selected right before we got on the air my second and third round picks in the Apex Expert League, a really fun format that Mike Brody runs. Definitely check that out if you have any interest. But I was lucky enough to have the 101, so you get Justin Jefferson, but then you get back at the 2-3. And even though both guys obviously have plenty of risk, I didn't think that there were any receivers anywhere close to Breece Hall and Ramondre Stevenson. In this particular league, the way that the experts draft, the QBs and the tight ends fall and fall and fall and fall. And so I don't want to put myself in a position where I draft guys at the 2-3 turn and get very similar prices, at the 8-9 turn. So you're looking at running back. And it wasn't just for me that I took Hall and Stevenson at the 2-3 turn, but the next two guys that I was considering after them. And I think that you could make an argument that maybe I'd be in a lot better shape if I had selected them. The next two guys were Gibbs and ETN. Mm-hmm. If you can get those guys where you can get them, which tends to be in the 3-4, I have the main event and Fantasy Pros ADP pulled up here, where Gibbs is the 307 and ETN is just amazingly the 406. And those are fantastic prices on guys who, I think you get value at the 2-3 turn. So again, this is a season that creativity is going to be really important. Getting locked into structures is going to be a little bit less effective, and taking a full portfolio approach with structures is going to be less effective, because the draft is giving you some crazy opportunities that if you have a more of a player agnostic approach to fantasy, you will not be able to take fully advantage of in this really fun draft season.
That's exactly right. And I think, this has been a really fun episode, because running back is the position that so many, all of our draft strategies revolve around it, right? Shawn, 0 RB, anchor RB. Everyone wants to put RB in the title. What are you doing with your running backs is always the question in fantasy. This is the most unique running back drafting landscape that I've ever seen. You can argue 2016 when, receivers pushed way up after the 2015 running back apocalypse. I don't think 2016 was as unique as 2013 or 2023 is. It's similar in how the running back ADPs have all fallen. We've never played fantasy football with this type of running back landscape. You're the person that I would ask this question to. You're the other person that I've played for 24 years now. 1999 was my first year, but I love chatting with you about the stuff that's 20 years old. Do you remember? Do you think that's hyperbole, that this is the most unique running back ADP landscape we've ever seen?
I think so. I think about the early years when I was doing it seriously in that sort of 2008, 2009 range that I referenced before. I really think that prior to that, there are going to be some listeners who are really early NFFC, FFPC drafters who, were in a more of a high stakes environment even prior to that. But I do tend to think of the time period before that as being the standard scoring era.
Yeah.
And you get an entirely different dynamic with that and with the running backs, at a time period where you're having guys like a Marshall Faulk, a LaDainian Tomlinson, a Priest Holmes. This is crazy, and it's a lot of fun, and it's fun in part because it's going to be really easy to get wrong. And so if you have guts this year, if you have courage and you go out and number one, you do some interesting structures, and number two, you take some risky guys, it can blow up in your face. And so, you could be looking back at the end and thinking, why did I do any of that stuff? I could have just gone with receivers and then filled in like I always do, and it would have worked better. I don't know. It depends on how many teams you're doing, what those entry fees are. Yeah. If you're doing 1 or 2 main events, it's going to be very different than if you're thinking through your portfolio from the perspective of drafting 150 underdog teams. You're doing different types of things there. But my personality or my belief in terms of tactical creativity and my comfort level with risk encourages me to take some chances and to hit some upside plays and to not get caught up in, you don't want to get caught up in your own past or your own brand or your own thoughts that maybe, still make sense. If anything, people are buying into it more, but then do you need to pivot? You don't want to go out and be like, okay, well, I believed in zero RB for 15 years and it worked well, but the season that it really crushed everything, I drafted hyper fragile. That's not what we're going to do. We're not going to have like some incredibly high percentage of hyper fragile teams. But Ben, one of the reasons why I'm looking forward to this is I do think that this is more or less the first time that if you really wanted to move off of a wide receiver heavy approach, you've got a shot to make that work and for the evidence to actually be in your favor. We love drafting the wide receivers. We're going to have lots of wide receiver guys. But again, it goes back for me to, you have to be very intentional with the players you're selecting, because you could get some teams this year that end up being better than teams have ever been simply because the mix of running back profiles and breakout wide receiver profiles that you can draft on the same team is so exciting.
Yeah.
Again, there's going to be some risk. So you want to draft the teams that work for yourself. You want to draft to your own risk profile. You want to draft to how you are entering leagues so that you're not, setting money on fire that you can't afford, all of those types of things. You want to lean into your own belief system in 2023, but within that, have some fun with it. And if it makes sense to be creative, I encourage people to do it.
So well put. Yeah, I can't wait. It gets me really excited, Shawn, for us to start drafting some of our main events together. It's one of my favorite things about doing teams with you. I do teams with a lot of co-managers, and I have a lot of fun with all of them, but I always feel like the ones with you are the ones where we can get the most creative. I feel like you're the one that's, of anyone that I draft with, that's willing to really, think outside the box on builds and structures and the ways that we're applying. We spend so much time talking about, I don't want to say the basics, but like the things that we believe, like we spent a lot of time over these last couple of years talking about, why wide receivers are so much more important to be taking early, and the redundancy there is important. Talking about the running back position, talking about things like the dead zone. And then you get into a year like this, and we spend a lot of the time on this show talking about how, well, those dead zone trends, there was always that small exception that there's going to be one or two guys in a given year that could probably succeed out of the dead zone because they're that type of first or second year back that has a type of profile that could be exciting. But this year, there's like 5 of them instead of 2, right? And so maybe, if you believe all those, foundational things that we've talked about, maybe this is a year where you do attack the dead zone a little bit, or, all of those ways that, okay, so then what happens when you do that? What happens when you take this many detours away from that goal of building wide receiver depth in the first 8-10 rounds? If you take an early QB or an early, elite tight end, which we've talked about, certainly elite tight ends, but the early QB thing is a whole new element and adds a layer of creativity. We've always talked about that. What's so fun about Superflex is the quarterback position, being viable in the early rounds. Well, now in single QB, it's arguably viable. It's certainly viable by ADP. We initially this offseason, we're both like, hey, we're going to kind of pass on this a little bit, but I've certainly started to take some more of those guys because you want exposure to those players. I don't think they should go that high, but I don't want to play a fantasy season where I don't have any exposure to Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, or Jalen Hurts, or any of the other ones that are going up that high. That seems crazy. So, you get, like you said, the creativity level has to be ratcheted up because we got to reincorporate early QBs. That's a new thing that's not been around for 5 years. And then, the dead zone running backs and everything. It's different. I'm still, every year I do a big structural drafting post, how I'm, sort of approaching drafts from a structural standpoint within that season at Stealing Signals. And I wrote to the subscribers recently that I'm still thinking through how I'm going to approach that this year because it's a unique year. And so like you said, you got to be creative. You got to think outside the box. You have to understand the principles, and then, how do you not stray too far from getting off track when you start doing these unique things as well, right? Because we want to be able to be flexible and do unique things is what we're saying, but also, okay, how do I land that plane in the second half of the draft, right? How do I make up for the fact that I maybe didn't take enough receivers early or what have you? It's going to be a blast. I'm looking forward to our drafting coming up soon.
The subtext there in what Ben is saying is that of all the people he drafts with, I'm the person most willing to do things that will absolutely blow up in our faces. we can't wait. We're going to do a lot of fun drafts. That'll do it for today's episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. His Stealing Signals post on the AFC West just released a few minutes ago. By the time you guys get this, it'll be about a day old. You don't want to let it marinate any longer than that. Get over there, sign up for Stealing Lines as well. If for some reason the entire rest of the internet doesn't work for you, our posts on Stealing Bananas have those links directly to Ben. You run across those articles, you'll find it there. Obviously, you find it plenty of other places. We'd love to have you over at RotoViz. The coupon code is RVRadio 2023, 10% off your 1-year subscription. If this gets you fired up to do 100 drafts, join us at Underdog. Coupon code RotoViz, 100% match up to $100. We'll talk to you guys soon.